Hello everybody and welcome along to the Event Industry News podcast. My name is James Dickson, wishing you all a very good morning, a good afternoon or a good evening, whenever or wherever you are tuning into today's podcast from. On today's podcast, we're going to be talking robotics. August Robotics publicly unveiled its first robot, Lionel, the revolutionary trade show floor marker at the 85th UFI Global Congress held last autumn in St. Petersburg, Russia. The Hong Kong-based robotics and artificial intelligence company aims to bring automation and innovation to trade shows around the world, helping trade show companies and venues make their exhibition build-up processes more reliable, efficient, and safe. August Robotics was represented at the Congress by CEO Alex Wyatt and General Manager for Germany, Jean-Michael Haas. And I'm delighted to say that joining us from their base in Hong Kong on the show today is Alex Wyatt. Alex, thank you very much for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me, James. Much appreciated.
Fascinating. And I should point out, first of all, our first guest to join us from Hong Kong. We've had lots of transatlantic guests where people have joined us from the USA and other parts of the globe. But Hong Kong is another first for the podcast. So it's great to have you on the show today. As I said in the introduction there, you are a Hong Kong-based robotics and artificial intelligence company. And Lionel, as a robot and as a product, is a trade show floor marker. So I suppose the obvious question to start with is, why was it created?
Okay, so Lionel was created to take the effort and a lot of the trouble out of the backbreaking task of marking the stand construction layout on the floor. So in any trade show, there's a CAD file that is painstakingly put together, as I think most of your listeners would know, for over 11 and a half months or whatever it is before such time as the event happens. And then right at the very end, it is sort of often printed out on a piece of A4 paper. And there's armies of people with tape measures and what have you that are instructed to convert that from a piece of paper onto the floor in the trade show venue. And this process is labor intensive. It's not particularly well suited to humans, so it can be inaccurate. And it cannot be very safe in the sense, particularly if it's being done simultaneously with takedown, or rigging work, it can be quite dangerous. And so why Lionel was invented was to do this task for event organizers. And so to take it takes the CAD plan as an input. So you email Lionel, he has his own email address, lionel@augustrobotics.com. You email to Lionel your CAD plan for the show. And then Lionel then finds himself in the hall. We press a red button, and then autonomously he will print the layout of the show on the hall. And so you have all of the stand outlines on the hall floor. So it's like a giant printer.
And how does that actually manifest itself? Because, I've been there. I've been on trade show floors, in empty warehouses armed with rolls of tape, measures, pieces of chalk. You make all sorts of markings and lines manually. How does Lionel actually go about marking those positions on the floor itself?
Yeah, so quick answer to your question is we have multiple different attachments for Lionel. And so it depends on different markets around the world. So some people like to use paint. Particularly in sort of the European markets, they like to use paint on the black floor and then they'll paint over it because the floor is all black. In other parts of the world, it's sort of a concrete floor, so they tend to prefer to use chalk or indeed tape. And Lionel has all sorts of different attachments that can fit in with what the existing client uses. So if your exhibition center currently uses chalk, then we will attach the chalk attachment onto Lionel. If it uses paint currently, then we'll use the paint attachment. And we can use all sorts of different colors and sort of thicknesses and what have you of these various attachments.
Now, presumably, you go in and you're wanting to deploy Lionel in a particular setting, in a particular trade show venue or a big convention center. Lionel presumably needs points of reference in order to be able to navigate the room in much the same way as you would have an autonomous car, that they would need points of reference in order to navigate safely around any given area. How does Lionel navigate safely and accurately around any given space?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that, James, so thank you. This is one of the things that is really special about Lionel, and one of the things that was, made our technical task in the R&D process a lot harder, is we wanted to make sure that Lionel was able to be used in any hall around the world. And we didn't want a situation where we needed to map the whole hall and have Lionel sort of get used to the hall each time and what have you, because we wanted to be able to deploy this everywhere. From the UK to Germany to the USA to Australia, wherever, we want to be able to deploy it. And so essentially we've designed it in a way where Lionel is able to orientate himself with what we call a lighthouse that we bring along. So we bring along a robot and a lighthouse, and we put the lighthouse in the middle of the hall, and then Lionel will orientate himself according to that lighthouse. The only thing we need to do at the very, very beginning of the process is basically tell the lighthouse where it is on the map. And so there needs to be a connector point. And so a lot of halls will already have an existing reference point. If they don't, then we'll create one out of a door or, you know, a pillar or something like that. Sure. And then once our lighthouse knows where it is, the robot is able to navigate autonomously around the hall with very, very high degrees of accuracy. So, you know, we can talk about a 10,000 square meter hall or an even larger hall than that. And we can navigate to very, very high accuracies, you know, low centimeter accuracies, indeed in many cases millimeter accuracies.
And tell me, I've had experiences myself working as a freelancer at trade shows where you're marking out a room and you have what is given to you as a supposedly very accurate CAD drawing of the room that's completely accurate to every last millimeter.
Yeah.
But you will often find discrepancies between those CAD drawings, and when you actually get on site and get into that room, you'll find a pillar that's not marked, or a fire exit where there is maybe a 500 mil, point that comes out into the show floor that's not marked on the diagram. I suppose what I'm asking is, how does Lionel navigate, and how do you deal with discrepancies once you actually get on site between the room as it is in its physical appearance and the CAD drawings that you've worked to in advance?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. There are two answers to it. The first answer is Lionel's not going to crash. Like if there's a pillar that's in the wrong spot or anything like that, he's not going to crash because he has dynamic obstacle avoidance technology in him. And that's not just designed for a pillar that's in the wrong place. That's designed for, if James walks across in front of Lionel, we want Lionel to avoid James. Also, if people leave boxes or various other things that clearly are marked in a CAD plan, if there's a random box or a piece of rubbish or an old stand or something like that, then Lionel needs to be able to navigate around what we call dynamic obstacles. So he's not going to crash into anything that's out of line. The second part of your question is, do we adjust the CAD layout accordingly? Mm-hmm. Right? And this is more a matter of judgment, right? In the sense that, it's like, okay, well, this was supposed to line up with the pillar. Should we move everything across a little bit to account for the fact that the pillar's seemingly in the wrong position, right? Lionel, for very obvious cases, Lionel is able to do that automatically and with sort of artificial intelligence and what have you. What it will do is, if the discrepancy is very high, is it will say, well, look, these are the two scenarios that we can apply. There's an operator on site. One of the things we'll talk about later is the service delivery model, and that operator will then be able to choose, right? Where there's no pillars, it's not really a problem at all, right? Because if the walls are a little bit out, there's usually a buffer between the wall and the actual plan. And so as long as the plan, relatively speaking, is all accurate, if it's phase shifted a couple of, 500 millimeters north or 500 millimeters southwest, it doesn't really matter. The only time it can become a bit of an issue is if a pillar is supposed to be exactly on a corridor, and because the CAD is not quite accurate, the pillar ends up being jutting into the corridor. Sure. Well, then what Lionel will do is move everything out. And we've given it a sort of a hierarchy of needs. And essentially, if pillars are in the middle of a booth, if it sort of moves a little bit, we'll leave it, right? Because who knows, right? But if it's supposed to be right in a corner of a booth or something like that, then we will phase shift everything accordingly. Sure.
Speaking purely from experience within the UK sector and some of the, I suppose, the regulations that people are required to work under on a trade show floor environment, there are very strict guidelines as to how wide access walkways need to be for the general public. There are strict guidelines on how close things can be to fire exits, and these sort of critical measurements that you have to be conscious of all the time when you're marking out a show floor. I would guess that given the level of artificial intelligence that's built into Lionel, it's not just the actual marking of the spaces itself and the booths and the stands that have been booked on that show floor, but you can also factor in in any given territory, what the regulations may be, so that it can make decisions for itself as to how wide corridors need to be and things like that? Will it factor those in?
Oh, absolutely. And you know what we'll do even flag that up beforehand, in the sense that, you know, when we get the plan in, and one of the things about Lionel, and, you know, we haven't quite released this feature yet, but it will be out quite soon, is a simulator for clients. So you can essentially, you put in your plan, and then there's an online simulator. You log in with your login name, you say, here are all the plans, and you press the simulator and you can speed it up at 100x or 1000x or what have you. And you can see the path that the robot will take, and, you know, which marks it will do and which way it will go. And the ones that are already marked are in green, and the ones that are, you know, haven't yet marked are in a certain other color in gray or what have you. And you can move through and see the robot. When we go through the process of internalizing that diagram, you know, those sorts of things can be checked, right? In terms of, have we met all of the regulatory requirements, right? And so in many ways, one of the great things about doing these things using IT is that you can simulate thousands and thousands of times, in terms of beforehand, if you wish. And that enables you to, you know, to keep an eye out for these sorts of regulatory requirements. And then what you can do is, rather than get to the actual day when you've marked the floor and say, oh, hang on, the corridor is only 2.7 meters instead of 2.8, you can actually tell them beforehand, look, actually, you've put that booth a bit too big, and as a result, in our simulation, has revealed that the corridor is too narrow in the southeast corner, right? And then there's time to fix it, rather than it being actually on the day.
That's interesting. And I suppose that also leads me to a couple of what you may call fundamental questions related to operating time and speed. Again, perhaps from not necessarily a safety point of view, but how fast does the actual robot travel when it's in operation, and what is the operating time? Because presumably to operate with the flexibility that it needs, it's battery powered, so that there are no mains cables connected to it.
Yeah, that's right. He doesn't carry around a big cable, so he's got a very big battery inside of him. We do refer to him as Lionel as a bit of a tangent. When we were naming him, we thought a female name suited better, but when we thought of a trade show robot that would be drawing lines on the floor, Lionel was just too good to resist, and so as a result, we refer to him as a him. He does have a big battery inside. He's able to, if you fill up the battery, I think there's more than at least 10 hours of operation, and in many cases sort of 14 or 15. And so we have no huge concerns about that. On average, it would be about 13 hours of operation. And when you don't do that, we can swap the battery out or just bring another line up. So in terms of power, this is not the concern that we have. In terms of time, obviously this is a trade-off between how many markings you need to make. So, you know, if you only have to make 20 markings in a room, then it's obviously going to be very fast, and a lot faster than if you need to make 600. But it's a time trade-off between the number of marks and the size of the hall.
Sure.
But if you would look at, you know, let's say a 10,000 square meter hall, you know, say a pillarless 10,000 square meter hall with average sort of density, maybe 120 booths or something like that, then, you know, we would expect that Lionel would be able to do that certainly in 3 to 4 hours, and probably less than that, to mark the hall. Now, of course, if there are any clients that have a particularly urgent hall that needs to be marked, there's not just one Lionel. We can deploy two Lionels, and therefore the time will then halve, right? So, you know, the east side is done by Lionel 1 and the west side is done by Lionel 2, and then instead of 3 to 4 hours, you're looking at 1 to 2 hours. Theoretically, you could have 3 or 4 Lionels and do the whole thing in half an hour. But, you know, often people don't need it that much. But, you know, what we're looking at is Lionel's not just about saving people from this job. You know, this is a really difficult job. You've had experience of it yourself. It's not just about that, but it's also about utilization of trade show centers. And so, you know, if we can do this in a way that you can do it at nighttime, Lionel doesn't charge penalty rates, right? He can work at night, work on weekends. He can also work when the rigging work is undergoing, right? So, you know, there's an exclusion zone currently. If people are doing rigging work up the top, there's an exclusion, not allowed underneath, because, you know, spanner might fall and hit James on the head, and, you know, it's not a good thing. Clearly, we don't want Lionel to get smashed up too much, but, you know, we can deal with that more than a human getting injured. And so as a result, what we are aspiring to do is, as a result of being able to use that sort of downtime, it's got lots of obstacle detection. So when takedown's going on, we can still mark part of the hole where it hasn't yet quite been taken down. What we're aiming to do is to reduce sort of what they call in the US market straight line time, to reduce it to close to zero. So if you can take advantage of nighttime, take advantage of like the time when it would normally be an exclusion zone, takedown time, essentially remove all of the time, then what that can do is for owner operators. So if the show operator is also the owner of the venue, it can greatly increase utilization. Yeah. Where there's a situation where the show operator will rent the venue, they could potentially rent it for a day less. And so in terms of because you don't need the whole day to like mark the floors, which is a very, very time intensive task. You can have, as you well know, you can have large teams. You can have six people in a hall or whatever. It still take you all day to do it in many cases. So if you can remove that day or remove a day and a half or what have you for some of the really big shows, that can greatly reduce your rent. So this isn't just about, oh, well, Frank used to do this, maybe the robot can do it. It's about trying to increase utilization and increase efficiencies in the show setup process.
Sure, because often until the floor is marked out, there are other critical elements of infrastructure that can't physically come in until everything is marked out accurately. So you are waiting on that space to be marked out in order for other stuff to happen. So if there's any delay in that, if it takes a longer period of time than you'd scheduled for, you're eating into time, you're eating into cost, you're eating into build. You may be having to make compromises elsewhere. One thing that I was curious to ask about is the trust element. Whenever we, as humans, when we hand something over from being a manual job to being an automated job, we often have this instinct that we want to double check it. There's this sort of trust element involved. And I can envisage, perhaps rightly or wrongly, that first-time users will see Lionel deployed. You guys will have spent thousands and thousands of pounds, dollars, hours investing and making sure that it's completely accurate. And yet a first-time user will still go around with their tape measure and just double check for their own peace of mind that it's okay, which perhaps then means that they're still putting in the same amount of time to walk the show floor. How do you negate that whole trust issue with people who may be new to this type of technology?
Well, look, I mean, it's something we'll probably talk to you about in 6 months, James, in the sense that, we've only just in November, just did a soft launch of the robot, and, commercial operations won't start for a couple of months. But my suspicion is exactly the same as yours, which is the first time that we do it, we'll go around and check it, or the client will go around and check it. I understand that urge in the sense that whenever we do testing with the robot, the engineering team here will all groan because I'll bring my tape measure and I'm exactly the same. Like, I want to check it and see how it goes. What I can say from personal experience is that fairly quickly after, it's a fairly onerous task to check them. And when you're checking them all and they're all like accurate to within the last millimeter, you pretty quickly gain some trust that this robot knows what it's doing. And you look at the rest of the hall and you're like, all right, I think I can trust you, robot. But I think that's going to be a process that everyone's going to go through. And, I think for the first show, there'll be quite a lot of checking. Thereafter, the show will go well and, we've checked it all. It's all within, centimeter or 2 centimeters accurate. Everything went fine. There'll be a lot more trust next time. Right. And in many ways, if you think about it, it's probably exactly the same with the manual workers. So, most of the exhibition centres, back in the old days, they have their own teams to do it. And then they handed it over to subcontractors. No doubt they would have gone and checked it the first couple of times, right, for the subtractor. Because, we know what we're doing. Does our subcontractor know what they're doing? And then, they'll check it. Oh, yeah, okay, well, we'll stop checking up on the subcontractor's work. They seem to know what they're doing. The last couple of shows went okay. I think Lionel will be essentially the same process. And that really brings us to, to what we call our business model as well. Yeah. We're not in the business of selling this robot to exhibition companies. What we are essentially is just like any other contractor, but instead of coming with a collection of workers and tape measures and what have you, we come with one person and a collection of robots. Right? And that one operator will potentially have control sort of 2 or 3 robots going simultaneously, either in the same hall or in separate halls. So, hall 1 will have one Lionel going, hall 2 will have another one, and the operator will be sitting somewhere with a little tablet that will be monitoring the progress of those robots. And so really what we are is a robotic-enabled subcontractor. We will be charging exhibition companies not for the cost of the robot, but in the same way that their subcontractors charge, which will be like a per hall or a per show basis.
So just to clarify, in the same way that an exhibition organizer would build in a shell scheme contractor or an electrical contractor to deliver all the cabling, or a Wi-Fi contractor, they would bring you guys in as a contractor, but your specific task is to come in on day one and get that floor marked out.
Yeah, and more likely, just given the advantages of robotics, would be probably to come in at night and they'll show up at 8 in the morning and all the floors will be done. Right? I mean, that's basically the idea. But it would be, we are delivering a service and we're delivering it in a much more accurate and more reliable way because it's using machines, and it's, to get centimetre accuracy, millimetre accuracy with human beings is really hard. And, you'll see, I mean, I've seen a lot of this stuff being done manually. They will start at the door and it's like, okay, 3 metres to the first booth. If that's out by a centimetre, that's the next reference point. 3 metres to the next booth. And unless you're really lucky that they keep equalising each other, then you end up, you can end up a metre out by the time you get to the end of 200 marks.
Absolutely.
Whereas what the robot will do is it checks its position each time, so you don't accumulate the errors.
So, Alex, given the technology that is being deployed here, at the start you mentioned that Lionel is referenced by this lighthouse that's placed within any given venue. That there presumably is a constant line of communication bouncing backwards and forwards from Lionel to this lighthouse, this point of reference. What benefits does that bring, that constant line of communication?
Yeah, I mean, as I just mentioned, when you do it as a human being or a team of human beings, you get the accumulation of errors. Whereas what Lionel will do is every single time before he makes a point, he will work out his coordinates. And so, if there's an error in the previous one, which there won't be because Lionel is supremely accurate, but if there were to be some kind of miracle and there'd be a small error in the previous mark, that won't in any way affect the next mark. Because each time there's an independent, what we call localization. So Lionel knows his coordinates within the trade show floor and then is able to mark. And so you don't get the accumulation of errors that you get with human teams that do this. And one of the things that, we talk about utilization of halls and what have you. One of the things that, we've heard a lot from trade show companies is, they will allocate a day for floor marking or a day and a half or whatever it is. And then, as you said, there's a very packed schedule thereafter because nothing can happen until the floor has been marked.
Sure.
They might get to the end of the day and then it's like, we're a metre and a half out. This is a disaster. We have to pull it all back up and do it again. And then that just means that a very rushed sort of 2 or 3 day setup process becomes an even more rushed 1 or 2 day setup process. And as you mentioned before, compromises are made and that impacts the overall show. Whereas as we're doing it with extreme accuracy delivered by a machine, and then objective accuracy for every single point, we're never in a position whereby you're going to end up miles out at the end. And so you can be absolutely sure that everything will be accurate. And you can also plan the time a lot better. So the simulator that I mentioned earlier will tell you down to the last minute how long it will take to mark the hall. And so you can then know exactly when it's going to be finished and then know exactly when the next people need to come in to start laying carpet or building stands or what have you.
As we sort of push on through today's episode, I'm keen to ask, with it only being unveiled publicly in autumn, I think it was October, November last year, 2018, how soon, is there a timeline in place already for you actually having this deployed, and are there already contracts and agreements in place with clients to actually utilise Lionel?
Right, so yeah, we launched it, we did a soft launch in November in the beautiful city of St. Petersburg at the UFI conference. And we also did a small launch as well at the Expo conference in New Orleans in December. And so that was sort of the launches. Look, this is what we do. In terms of commercial operations, we've just started negotiating those. So literally this week, we've started doing some negotiations with some of the price negotiations and what have you with some of the larger continental exhibition centres. And we anticipate that, as soon as those negotiations are complete, then we're ready to start. we're ready to start operations. So, these things typically take a little while. So we would hope to see news of, Lionel's commercial operations by the summertime.
Sure. And how many actual Lionel robots are in existence at the moment? And in a best case scenario, if this technology took off and people really saw the benefits immediately and said, "Great, we need to use those," how quickly can they be produced?
Yeah. So to answer your first question, I think we have about 6 different Lionels at the moment, and they're all basically the same. And then we've got lots of different attachments. As I mentioned earlier, there's paint and, these other things that can go on. In terms of how quickly they can be made, very quickly, quick enough in the sense that we have, a pretty good design and a pretty good tech team, and we have a workshop out the back. Sure. We make those ourselves. In the sense that we deploy a service model. So it's not like a mass manufacturing thing where you have like a telephone where you need to make 20,000 of them or what have you. Yeah. We can cover a whole market with, 20 or 30 Lionels, right? And they just need to drive around to the different exhibition centers in the area, and then they can all do their work, right? We don't need thousands of Lionels, but we do need all of the Lionels to be consistent and to be updated. And, one of the benefits of our sort of service model is that, if you were to sell a product, if someone gets an early product, then there's, it may not be upgraded, it might be out of date, it might not be maintained properly. What we do is we'll make sure that, whenever we bring a robot on site for a client, it's always the latest version, it's always up to date, it's always well maintained and can deliver the service that we need. We will also have there's always, as I mentioned before, a human operator from August Robotics on site. Mm-hmm. You might have multiple Lionels to control, but that's then just also a backup. If for whatever reason, let's say there's a big box that's been left, where there needs to be a mark. Lionel can't mark if there's a big box on the space that, on the coordinates where there needs to be a mark. Then, the human being can come and move that box and Lionel can do it. If Lionel's already been closed down, the human being can do that by hand, right? I mean, we're not obsessed with the point where, you have to automate, the last mile always, right? 99.9% or 99% is fine. And if, a human has to do a couple of bits around the site, that's no problem at all, right? We're not going to sort of get religious about this.
Absolutely. We've been talking on the podcast today to Alex Wyatt. Alex is a CEO of August Robotics, and we've been discussing Lionel, the revolutionary trade show floor marker that was unveiled publicly at the 85th UFI Global Congress last autumn in St. Petersburg in Russia. Alex, if any of our listeners and our podcast followers want to find out more about Lionel and what you guys do at August Robotics, how can they get in touch with you guys?
Oh, so we would welcome anyone from around the world that does floor marking to get in touch with us. Our website is www.augustrobotics.com, and we're also on LinkedIn and Facebook and the various other social media sites. But the right website, www.augustrobotics.com.
Really easy. And fascinating. As I said, I've got a bit of experience of doing the job in the traditional sense, I suppose we can call it now. And it'll be fascinating long term to see how this particular piece of technology becomes involved within the industry and how well it's received and how well it does. But very best of luck to all of you guys over at August Robotics. Alex, thanks for joining us on the podcast today, all the way from Hong Kong. If you want to watch the video version of this podcast, if you are listening to one of our audio links, head over to eventindustrynews.com and you'll be able to see a video of Alex sat in his Hong Kong office with a picture of Lionel in the background. And of course, if you're watching the video version of this podcast on eventindustrynews.com, then head over to your favorite podcast platform. All of the previous episodes of the podcast are there for you to listen to and maybe put on your headphones on your commute to and from work. But for now, we're going to wrap up today's episode and we'll see you on the next edition of the Event Industry News podcast. My name's James Dickson. Thanks very much and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.